happiness. Why? Where does it originate from? Once you accept that, now we've moved beyond that in what we call the secular time. We all want life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, but we don't necessarily want the creator that gives it to you, so we erase that, and now we can get to proportionality reviews and lex talionis. Now, if you take someone's life, then we can take your life. It's predicated or built upon rejecting the whole foundation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The state does not have a right to ever violate someone's life. Well, hang on a minute. Except with just cause. We'll get to that when we talk about the distinction between murder and killing. So it gets complicated. We have a variety of values that are at stake here, and they're competing for our attention when it comes to the death penalty. If you believe that that the creator is the value that establishes life, liberty, then no one has a right to supersede that. So when we take life, even in retribution, we're violating the original mandate. That becomes a problem. Maybe. And we can justify it. I mean, I can justify it. I can even go to the text and justify it for you, the biblical text. But that's the origin of it then, of the argument against retribution. You have no right to take someone else's life. Yeah, what they did was horrible. Put them in jail forever. Put them on an island with bare necessities. Otherwise, your conflict isn't with the killer. Your conflict is with the creator. Everybody get that? Okay. Say that again.
The Ten Commandments.
The Ten Commandments. Well, but the commandment is wrong. And I've shared this with you. Not the commandment is wrong. The translation we give it is wrong. It's a sixth commandment. And the Hebrew word, this English variation of it is tirtzach. It means to murder. If you get a good translation, it'll say thou shalt not murder. And it's often mistranslated, thou shalt not kill. And the reason for that is the biblical foundation for taking a life. It's in the Bible. Murder is unwarranted. You have no legitimate reason. Killing, there's a legitimate reason. Self-defense. You have a right to defend yourself. The nation has a right to defend itself. So it makes a distinction biblically between murder and killing. And the problem then is, well, if you were taught, how do I say this? I want to say it politely. If you were taught it says thou shalt not kill, and then some fool like me comes along and says, well, that's not right. The Hebrew word was tirtzach, and it really means murder. It's like, oh, no, that's not what I was taught. Well, I understand that. But the Hebrew word is tirtzach. It doesn't change. You can get translations, the original Hebrew, and look it up, and it will tell you that that word is tirtzach. Anyway, the whole reason for that is then we have this continuing distinction. So now we have the creator says no one can take someone else's life. In fact, you can't take your own life. It was prohibited under the original theory with John Locke. You could not commit suicide because you didn't give yourself life. The creator did. And then we get into all of this conversation about can we justify taking a human life or not. Did I muddy the water enough for everybody? What's at stake in all of this always is you come back to the innocent people. That's always what's at stake. You can make a very strong, reasonable argument for capital punishment. But when you make that argument, you also need to make a segue argument into, okay, but we're not going to kill the innocent because that would be a gross miscarriage of justice. That would be the grossest injustice. And no one's figured out how not to do that. So the death penalty is built upon or predicated upon justice. You can make a very strong defense of that, but you have to deal with the innocent people. Because as soon as you execute one innocent person and you know they're out there, even if you can't identify them, you become responsible for killing an innocent person. And some people will make an argument for murdering them because there's no just cause for killing an innocent person. And the whole point of this today, and I told you this when we went through embryonic stem cell research, there's 2 times in this course I'm going to raise concerns. The first one was tinkering with the blueprint of human life, and the second one is because of the innocence. The whole point of justice, people, is that the guilty have to pay for their crime, and the innocent should not have to, ever, especially the most egregious crime, which is a death penalty that they don't deserve. Okay, I'm out of my pulpit. Go ahead.
Just in thinking, hearing what you were saying, Professor, I mean, that's all based on a perfect scenario. There are a lot of chaos factors, such as nothing's really perfect. It's not a perfect world. I'm talking talking about as far as the argument goes that we discussed. Corruption. I know justice is supposed to be blind, but I'm sure there's plenty of corruption that's out there too. Would that be considered a major factor?
There's all factors, yeah. There's no argument that there are factors. But again, if the whole point of this is justice, and don't forget the retributive argument is based on what? Simple what? Justice, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You can have it, but you cannot allow injustice. I don't know how you justify injustice when you're looking for simple justice. Injustice is a whole different ballgame, Jada.
If that's the case, then we need to strike out innocent until proven guilty. Because what if someone's convicted of guilty and then later on found out they were innocent?
I don't know if I agree with that. The whole point of innocence is to avoid finding innocent people guilty. The French law says you're guilty till you prove yourself innocent. That's really a weird law. That goes back to when the king ruled. You were always guilty. If he said you were guilty, you were guilty. If you're in my intro class, we'll talk about Friedrich Nietzsche and master-slave morality, and if you're not in charge, you're guilty. So I don't know if we want to really surrender that. The problem is we don't do it without error. And that makes us wonder, so why do we say innocent until proven guilty, and then we kill the innocent, or we incarcerate the innocent, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, it's a good point. It's a real good point. So, have I given you the right framework? Do you understand what's at stake at this? It's always the innocent that's at stake. Go ahead, dear.
One thing I don't understand is how people are pro-life and against abortion, but then they favor the death penalty. Hypothetically, the child that should have been aborted because of a mental illness could grow up to become that murderer that people want to put in death penalty.
Absolutely, yeah. There's another contradiction, isn't it? Yeah, it's a contradiction. And that brings us, that is such a good point. And I never know how, I can't emphasize this strongly enough. I've given you the example about the cracked plate and how it's still useful. And there's a good chance that the cracked plate describes human nature to a T, and that's why we do this. Because we're filled with contradictions. All the time. I mean, honestly, is anybody contradiction-free? Hasn't stood here and then stood over here? I mean, I can be completely pro-life, and yet if we could find a way to turn the switch in my Joe, my son with Asperger's syndrome, so he'd be normal like us, would I be justified in that? I mean, I'd be taking his life away literally. Would that still be my Joe? Yet if I could justify that, and I could take a stem cell from an embryo and decease the embryo so that my Joe could be normal, I could have a reasonable argument for that. That's the contradiction, isn't it? Pro-life and yet destroying an embryo to save a life. It's probably the most valid point in moral reasoning, is that we justify contradictions all the time. All the time. And the weird part is we make peace with it on top of it. We say, well, I can live with that. Of course we can. That's why we made them. Rachel?
So don't we usually justify it with research? Isn't that why people change their minds, because research is bad?
Well, that's one of the reasons, yes. Of course, we had the discussion forum conversation in here, didn't we, on Monday? Was it Monday or was it the week before? I asked how many of you were in online classes and they had discussion forums, and how many of you...
Yeah, that was last week.
Yeah, and that's based on science, supposedly, on research. I have yet to meet anyone except people who promote that believe that's true. On our level, faculty, students, I get an overwhelming negative. Yeah, but it is based on research. You're right. You're right. Okay, let me go on. We'll get to it. Okay. This argument would require that abolitionists deny the moral legitimacy of taking a human life in war, revolution, and in self-defense. If it's always wrong to kill, then you can't protect yourself either. You can't protect your loved ones. You can't protect the nation. If it's always wrong to do that, if there's never a legitimization for taking a human life. And this goes back to the distinction between murder and killing. If a murder cannot possibly claim such a right to life for himself, neither can anyone else do that on his behalf. He's given up that right. That's because he can convincingly claim these rights only so long as he acknowledges and respects the same rights of others. If he violates the rights of others, he thereby loses the same rights. If he's a murderer, he has no right to live. And that's how that argument progresses. You can't use the right to life argument when you remove someone else's right to life, not from a proportionality point of view. Some opponents of capital punishment claim that a criminal law system which indulges this punishment is contradictory because it prohibits murder at the same time it provides for its perpetuation. This argument is the result of misunderstanding the difference between murder and killing. Now, that doesn't mean it's right to make that distinction, but that distinction has held its ground legally and historically throughout all humankind. We've always made that distinction. All religious orders make that distinction. You have a right to defend yourself. You're not someone else's prerogative to take your life. You have a right to life. Some opponents of capital punishment attack the retributive rationale by questioning the claim that it's the only punishment that satisfies the demand for proportion between defense and punishment. They point out that any two human lives are different in many important respects, such as age, health, physical, mental capability, so it does not make much sense to consider them equally valuable. That's an interesting argument. You know, someone who's a 210 IQ and someone who's a 50 IQ. Is that how we evaluate it? It's a utilitarian argument that, well, everybody's not really equal, so how can you make this distinction between someone who kills and so, you know, we'll impose the punishment on you of an equal factor? What if everyone doesn't experience pain the same way? My middle boy Joe has the highest threshold of pain I ever met. We're driving back from the airport one day and suddenly he just throws up in the back seat. I said, Joe, why didn't you tell me you were getting ready to throw up? He says, I didn't know I was ready to throw up till I threw up. It's got an incredibly high threshold of pain. So I have other children, and I just have to look at them the wrong way, and they start to cry. They know what might be coming. And I look at Joe, and it's like, what? I didn't do anything. What? So how do I determine punishment for them? So the proportionality argument doesn't really float. No doubt any two human lives are different in innumerable ways, but this does not entail that they're not equally valuable. The modern humanistic and democratic tradition and ethical, social, political thought is based on the idea that all human beings are equal. If we're not willing to give up this principle, we have to stick to the assumption that all differences notwithstanding, any two human lives are equally valuable. And the retributionist says that that's just not a legitimate argument. It doesn't matter if you have a high threshold for pain or a low threshold for pain. If you do the crime, you're going to do the time. It's not based on your value as a human being. It's based on the fact that you remove someone else's value as a human being. Okay? I don't want to run out of time, so do you understand his argument? It's based on simple justice. You can make counter arguments all day you want. His argument is based on when you remove someone's right to life, you automatically lose your right to life. There's no argument about that. You can come up with theories all you want, and there are legitimate theories to support contradictions to this, but from his point of view, when you violate someone's right to life, you lose automatically your right to life, and therefore we're justified in taking your life. So if we look at this, the retributist argument for capital punishment, the punishment of criminals should be proportioned to the crime. The only punishment proportionate to murder is the death penalty. However, interestingly enough, the marathon bomber, all the families did not want the death penalty. The death penalty, they said, would be too easy a death. They wanted that person to rot in jail for the rest of their life. Well, now we go back to the whole utilitarian argument of how much punishment is enough punishment. How much pain is enough pain. And I tried to give you the example. I think I did it in here. I did it in the other two classes. That a 6-foot wide jail cell is 12 feet long. That's your crib.